Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing with me, William Hallowell. In this podcast series, I speak to industry and media colleagues about the biggest stories and issues in aviation. Today, I'm joined by Henrik Ambak, the chairman of the Air Cargo Handling and Logistics Conference, and Fabio Gamba, the Director General of the Airport Services Association. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me this afternoon.
Our pleasure.
So today, we're going to be talking about the recently proposed new regulations for ground handling that were made by EASA. Obviously, this is the first time that such regulations have been proposed at EU airports, and I know this is something that, Fabio, I know we've spoken before about how you see this as a very positive thing. So I guess I'll kick off with you and ask you, what does this mean for ground handling in Europe?
Well, a lot, and thanks for the invite, by the way. It means a lot to ground handlers in Europe, but not only in Europe, but we'll come on that after, I guess. I think what it means is something that goes beyond the mere crafting of a new legislation. I think what it means is currently three things and possibly another three things as well. So the first one is obviously puts us on a par with the airport and the aerodrome operators, where we're always the ones sandwiched between the two regulations of airports and or aerodrome and airline operators, and always told to do things this or that way. And unfortunately, I think we have to recognize that the industry, to a certain extent, fails to create its own standard, despite the fact that there are standards out there that are being recognized, but probably fails to implement them. And we see this regulation to put an end to that. Now, obviously, talking about standards, you would wish these standards are worldwide. We're only talking about around 30 member states in Europe. So that's not enough to create a standard, but certainly, and that's the second point, we believe that it's a bright step in the right direction, because it would certainly then be a strong call for the rest of the community to wake up and to say, hey, why are they doing that in Europe? And why don't we have this in the rest of the world? It makes sense. The ground handlers seem to be happy. It creates a local standard. Let's not reinvent the wheel. And let's try and apply as much as possible, of course, what they've come up with in the European Union or in Europe. Let's put it that way. And then the third thing is, and I mentioned to this, still this standards is extremely important, because so far we were, even in Europe, doing things at the same station in a different way, depending on the customer with whom we were working. So you may imagine that this may have a lot of impacts on safety, for instance, because for two different airlines, you need to do things differently. The number of chokes, the number of cones, the way simply to tackle what your customer wants. And so someone very, let's say, trained to do things a certain way, then needs to think that, okay, for this customer in particular, I need to do things differently. And this may have repercussions or certainly impacts on safety. So that is, in a nutshell, what I do believe the regulation will bring, and that's obviously huge. Now, there are also a number of things that it might bring, but only the future will tell us. I think it will have a major impact on the number of audits that we are subject to. Today, as you know, we are subject to thousands of hours of audits per year. And we understand why, because each airline wants to make sure that this is being done the right way, according to what they do believe is the right norm or the right way to do things. With that, normally, once you've been audited and ticked by an authority, normally you would expect the airlines to say, okay, that's fine, that's good enough. I don't have to audit you anymore. Or if there is an audit, then it should be a quick, straightforward audit and not a 3-day audit. So that's the first thing that we're hoping will happen. A second thing that should happen is that it will not add red tape to the whole thing. We have a certain confidence in the fact that it will indeed be the case, in that in the process of making this or releasing this opinion, the European agency has been extremely well listening to the stakeholders, and we told the agency that we were extremely wary of that happening. We couldn't afford, as a matter of fact, to add people to processes to make sure that we're pleasing the authorities, we're pleasing the airport authorities, we're pleasing the customers, and so on and so forth. It should be an agnostic, let's say, bureaucracy neutral process. And I think we've been listened to and heard, right? And then I would say perhaps another aspect is the fact that we are being treated just like the airlines are, with a principal place of business. As you know, for us, one of the major concerns, especially for the major companies which have operations in different countries, that could have been a problem to report to different authorities, and different authorities having different answers to your issues. And so possibly meaning that you would have to do things slightly differently in this or in that country. And by listening to, by discussing with the agency, we advance the idea of a principal place of business where you are mainly responsible for to report to, and hence that would then apply to the rest of the countries that you're operating at. And that is a hugely important topic, and we really hope that in the process of the opinion being transformed into a regulation, this principal place of business will remain, because that's an essential feature. Now, I'm going to stop there because I know they have taken already a lot of time, but these are the three actual, let's say, pluses that this regulation brings, and the three hopes that it will bring when it becomes a regulation next year.
Yes, standardization certainly is something that I want to move on to later on. But Henrik, if I could come to you in terms of, you know, the aircraft operating side of the impact of these regulations, you know, what are your kind of key takeaways of the proposals that EASA want to introduce?
Well, first of all, allow me to say I think it's great that the EASA comes forward with something like this. And I can easily second most of what Fabio just said. I think their airlines and the service providers have an absolute common interest. No argue about that. So it's a good move. It comes, of course, with a number of questions, especially talk about the consequences of this. And today in the regulations from a European, but also from other nations issuing AOCs to airlines, ground operations is considered the airline's responsibility. So when something goes wrong, the local investigating authority will not, you can say, hold the handling agent responsible, but hold the airline responsible as part of whatever safety or regulatory investigation that takes place. The first question you can ask yourself, and that is probably the key question airlines will ask itself from the beginning, what does that change anything in the responsibility that the airlines have? Will the airlines no longer be held regulatorily responsible, but can be able to say, well, that was our by the European Union authorized handling agent in airport XYZ who did this, so don't call us, please talk to them. So there's this discussion about how will this affect airlines' responsibility. And that when you're finished with European registered airlines, then you can start to ask yourself, what does it do with, and that also goes to what Fabio talked about, Europe versus global. What does that then do to non-European registered, being from the US, being Asian, being Middle Eastern carriers, with AOCs that are not necessarily changed, if that is what the EU does, not necessarily changed, and they're still sitting with a responsibility unchanged like they do it today. And that drives to one of the key discussion points, and Fabio had it, obviously, for good reasons, as part of his argument of the benefits in this, and that's to do with auditing. Auditing is something that we, of course, all dread, because we do a lot of it. All airlines do. All handlers, they probably have 2 assistants at each station doing nothing else than hand-holding auditors, which is the result. But don't forget that auditing from an airline perspective have at least 2 dimensions. It have a dimension of regulatory compliance, which is, you can say, what we are partly discussing here. And then it has an element of ensuring service delivery. And I think it's important when you discuss auditing and that benefit that you keep these two things clearly apart, because aviation is not aviation but aviation. What I mean by that, I mean that the airlines may choose to have different components in their service delivery that may differ. Airlines may be wanting to give their clients a different service experience, and they may want to follow up that is consistently implemented. So when we discuss this whole auditing element, I think today auditing has a regulatory compliance part, and then it has a service delivery part. And this service delivery part will likely not be affected by this. It is the regulatory compliance part. And getting to understand what EASA really intends here. Is this where the airlines can say, well, we used an authorized ground operator, so we are no longer held responsible for whatever happens? That, of course, would have an impact. If the authorities say, no, we do this to certify ground handlers at stations in the EU, good stuff, but the airline is still overall responsible, then I'm not so sure that the airlines would be able to reduce their auditing much, because they will be dependent on you can say, the solidity of what they're up against should worst come to worst. And we have all been, you can say, exposed to various other auditing schemes in the industry. And some of these audit schemes are better than others, in my little humble experience, which means that the moment you discuss relying on you can say, generalized auditing, you are at least briefed twice before you take a firm decision. So that would be my 2.5 cents on this.
So, Fabio, if I could go back to you, you've both mentioned how it will change the auditing side of things. EASA say that with these proposed regulations, they want to improve safety, cybersecurity, and consistency across everything that happens, before and after a flight. What will change with these new regulations, compared to the processes that you have now in regards to safety and cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, in terms of cybersecurity, to be honest, I think we would still have to see in real terms, to be honest. I'm not sure that it would change that much. I think we have to realize that Europe, and I'm not saying this because I'm based in Europe, but I think I'm saying that based on some experience. I think we already have the most sophisticated service in terms of ground handling that you may find on the planet, for a number of reasons that I don't think is the question to develop here. And hence, I think we'll continue to have them. It will bring perhaps a bit more standardization as it perhaps has in the past, but even that is probably only at a relatively small scale. I think what it does is mostly I would say, a political rather than technical points, in that, as I said in my first points, I think it brings us really on a par, and it creates a real triangle of the aerodrome, the airline, and the ground handlers, with each their own regulation, and each regulation having to be, or to combine the other two in its own regulation. So, and this is something that perhaps only a few people know. Obviously, the coming forth of the regulation on ground handling will have impacts on the regulation on aerodrome and on the regulation of airline operators, because they have to recognize each other. So they're intertwined. And to me, that's probably the most essential elements of it all. The fact that we already have very sophisticated, companies, say the vast majority of them, if not all of them, with safety management systems already in place and things like that. This will not obviously change that much because it was already the case before. I think it's just a step, a logical conclusion of a process that has started in the 1990s. And it's just a logical conclusion. And by the way, when EASA came up with its basic regulation in 2018 to say, well, safety starts first on the ground, it was just a logical conclusion of the process that I mentioned before. And that's excellence, because now we've come to maturity somehow. Back to Henrik's points of the responsibility. I think that's the real question, this real question mark indeed. And we need to pay to that question perhaps more attention than we have in the past, i.e. how do we not reconcile, but how do we consider the shifting of responsibility, if there is a shifting of responsibility? Who is in charge of what? Who is responsible or liable for what? And what consequences can that have once there is a recognition of this shifting of responsibility? In my opinion, it should be quite clear. This is a step towards the self-responsibility of ground handlers for themselves and for the service they offer. That's my personal opinion. Of course, this is not written, per se, as is in the regulation, but to me, that's a step towards this, right? But this is definitely a question mark that will need to be discussed and further in the future.
And Henrik, if I could go back to you, I mean, obviously both of you are enthusiastic about these changes. Do you think that the regulations could go further to help both the ground handling and the aircraft operators' sides?
Well, as Fabio just mentioned, and which is the core point is, what is it the regulator has in mind? Is this, you can say, an ISAGO thing, like the IATA thing, a little bit, I wouldn't say on steroids, that's the wrong way of putting it, but is it a different way of approaching what IATA attempts to do with ISAGO, or which has no legal effect in versus of the airlines, AOC, and operations and oversight and so forth? It can be a handy help tool, but there's no real legal consequences. Is this where the GHAs are being given a real responsibility and to owe up to? And here is the mechanism for the authority to have the oversight that responsibility is then also executed. Yeah, then of course it has a lot of implications, and this is what is interesting to hear from the authority. How far do they see this go? And what of course you have to avoid is that you are creating another layer of regulation, which is just adding unnecessary, you can say, bureaucracy and complexity. So I would say, if the intention is to go full Monty, I'm just about to say, and say this now means that GSA is truly responsible, the airline is no longer responsible. Yeah, fine, then it makes a lot of sense. But if it's an implementation adds unnecessary extra compliance workload on everybody, then it's not very helpful. And that is what I think needs to be looked at carefully when we come to the implementation discussion, that we don't end up with great idea, but now everybody needs to add another 2 auditors to make sure that, God forbid, but that we can actually live this.
And talking about,
if I can rebound on this, William, and that's a crucial point indeed. The intent, I think, is correct. The recognition of why there was a need for a regulation was ripe, and we agreed with it ever since we were told in 2018 that basic regulation would force EASA to come up with a regulation. We always said, be mindful of not adding complexity and red tape to the whole process, because we are already under here with that. So that is the first point. And the second point here is, make sure that your intents are clear and that you're looking at what to do and not so much telling us how to do this, because we know we know how our job needs to be done. And again, I think they've listened to that. And I think the opinion is a good transcript of the fact that they've listened. Now, what I think is important to say is there was definitely a situation where before regulation, it was becoming quite obvious, and especially after the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, that the situation of ground handling was unsustainable. If left to its own device and only directed by the forces of the markets, it was unsustainable. And we were already aware of this before the COVID-19, but I think COVID accelerated things. And, you know, despite the fact that we didn't see that many companies of ground handling disappearing, as a matter of fact, we were ourselves surprised to see that this industry was quite strong and resilient. We can see that this situation has worsened, and that the margins are getting thinner, that the gaps between the requests from the various airlines are getting bigger, and that we have really worrying situations. And as said, I think if only left to the device of the market, it would go against the wall. And that's why we see this regulation with excitement, really. But of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we have to see whether that responds to our expectations and hopes. But definitely the step is in the right direction, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let's talk more about standardization. You know, Fabio, there you've suggested that you'd like to see that. I mean, what's the likelihood that the kind of regulations that we're seeing now that EASA are proposing, is that likely to be seen elsewhere, say in North America with the FAA or other regulatory bodies, or is that unlikely?
Are you asking Henrik?
Oh, sorry, Henrik. Yes, of course.
That's a very good question. I mean, the US regulations and the European regulations are already today not the same. They have similarities, but they are also factual differences. I don't know. I would be the wrong person to have a view on that, to be quite honest.
I'll pass it back to you then, Fabio.
I mean, same here, but perhaps two things. When you have 30 plus countries agreeing on a common regulation, it bears weight, obviously. We know that ICAO is already thinking of, and has already started doing some work on ground handling. First with its documents on the SMS for ground handlers. It has also worked in bits and pieces in different annexes. And we know that Annexes 19 on SMS could be a good place for perhaps not a standalone annex on ground handling. I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, at least, but perhaps could become an annex where you would have more of a type of aspects covered in the EASA or in the EU regulation, translated into this Annex 19. And we also know that a number of member states are thinking of this. And these member states are, without any surprise, already member states which have adopted a regulation on ground handling. So they are a minority today compared to the 200 plus member states of ICAO. But I think it's a growing minority, and definitely the 30 plus of EASA will add up to this minority. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, indeed, there are a number of countries out there that are opposed to changing the status quo for a number of reasons. The US FAA, so far at least, is one of them. We've had discussion with the FAA, and I think the answer at this stage is always a little bit the same. It's like, well, it's not part of our mandate. And so we're not dealing with this. The airlines are responsible. We're dealing with the airlines. And to this, I want to say, yes, understood. Fine. But when you think about this, EASA didn't have the mandate before 2018 either. Right? It took the basic regulations, so the renewal of the regulation of, or the founding, if you will, regulation that creates EASA, to then grant EASA with the task of, doing or coping with ground handling as well. So you can always change this. It just needs a mind shift to think, is it correct or first, are we satisfied with the current situation? And I don't want to, point my finger at anyone, but if you're looking at the situation in the US, you will realize that in the US, in terms of ground handling, it's a bit worrying, right? And it's getting, in my opinion, worse than in the past. That bears some questions. And second, is the regulation perhaps a way to tackle the situation if we feel that we're not going in the right direction? But there are not that many other options. You cannot simply say, dear airlines, you're still responsible and you need to do things differently. We've tried this avenue, and ISAGO, or say IGOM, was a very promising one. It's still a very promising one. Everyone recognizes the excellence of IGOM and all the work that has been put into this. But unfortunately, it has not acted with the standard universally applied the way it should have had, it should have brought for the ground handlers, and even for the airlines. Some airlines don't even consider the full match of IGOM as being enough. They want plus, or they have deviances or different ways to do things. So again, I think the regulation will probably not change this, but it's another step towards a more formal standard, and it will take time. But so back to your points, yes, I see this as a step in the right direction to say to the rest of the world, hey, we need to do something about ground handling. This is not working like this anymore. The regulation is a possibility, but please then, if you do consider regulation in 5 years or 10 years, do not reinvent the wheel, because that would be the worst thing. If then the US and Australia and South Africa and Brazil and what have you, India, decide, or China decide to have their own regulation, and there are totally different regulations, then we're back to square one, right? That's why we need to have ICAO lead the process.
So, Henrik, I'm going to go back to you there.
Can I just say that I totally agree with Fabio that ICAO is the right body to take this on.
I was going to say, I wanted to come back to you just to get a response to what Fabio was saying, because, a face paints 1,000 pictures sometimes, and I could see there were several kind of facial expressions you were making in comparison to, what Fabio was saying. But I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to add there.
No, I think Fabio did a very well recap on this, and I totally agree that it's up to ICAO to pick this up and put the global guidelines out for countries to implement that they are, you can say, supposed to, due to their commitment to ICAO. So yeah, that is the way to do it. I fully agree. And the European can, as Fabio said, the European version can be, you can say, the standard. You can see now it's proven. Let's take it and let's globalize it. Spot on.
Well, look, gentlemen, thank you very much for taking some time to speak to me today. It's been great to have, the ground handling and the aircraft operating side, come together and kind of have a discussion about what it actually means in practice, So look, thank you very much again. And it'd be great to have you on again soon.